Hello everyone, today we'll be going over the list group label vocabulary strategy. Its general application and the benefits that it can have when you allow your students to use and practice this strategy in your classroom. But before we go over those things, we need to really understand what list group label is. Now, list group label is a vocabulary strategy where students are asked to generate a list of words, group them according to their similarities, then label the group. Now, one way to better explain this, an example, is let's say under my field of physical education, you allow the students to kind of draw connections between certain exercises and with the applications of those exercises. So a real quick example of it would be, let's say I give the students a prompt where I tell them, give me a list of exercises that target your upper body, a list of exercises that target your lower body, and a list of exercises that target your core muscles, or just any miscellaneous exercises. Now, under those labels, they would then need to group together a variety of exercises and then list them out under that label. So let's say under the upper body label, they list out push-ups, they list out bench press, they list out shoulder press, just different exercises for the upper body, and they don't need to give a exact definition of it as long as they are grouped together and they fall under that certain label. That right there shows that they understand an application of it. Now, moving on into, where did I first see this strategy? Now, obviously, the reading of the text, that allowed me to better understand the way to implement it. But really, it's just prior experience with this strategy. And I wouldn't say this is strictly an academic strategy. This can be applied to really any aspect of your life. You build connections across multiple different ideas, multiple different, words, terms throughout your life, that you implementing new strategies within those connections you've already made just makes that like 10 times easier. A quick example of that would be, let's say that you implement a new vocabulary word for your student. Oh, fuck. That's terrible. Hello everyone, today we'll be going over the list group label vocabulary method and Hello everyone, today we'll be going over the list group label vocabulary strategy and ways it can benefit your students and ways to apply it in your own classroom. Now, first, before we go into those things, we need to figure out exactly what the list group label method is. Now, the list group label method is a vocabulary strategy where students are asked to generate a list of words, group them according to their similarities, then label the group. Now, one example of this in my field of physical education would be if I were to give the students three different columns. Say column 1 is upper body exercises, column 2 is lower body exercises, and then column 3 is core exercises or just miscellaneous exercises in general. And then I give the students a prompt to then, under those 3 columns, come up with the different exercises, list out exercises that would fall under that label and put them in and group them together so that they all fit within that label. Now, what this would do is it wouldn't require them to give a definition of any of the exercises that they put down, but it would require them to make that connection to the label itself. And that connection, Hello everyone, today we'll be going over the list group label vocabulary strategy and ways to implement it in your class and ways that would benefit your students. So before we go over any of those things, we need to figure out what exactly list group label is. Now, it is a vocabulary strategy where students are asked to generate a list of words, group them according to their similarities, then label the group. Now, one example of this in my field of physical education would be if I were to give the students 2 categories. Those categories would be labels. Label 1 is upper body lifts. Label 2 is lower body lifts. Now, under those labels, I would then prompt the students to list out exercises that fall under those labels. And that list would be a group that falls under the label. So let's say under the label of upper body lifts, I, have the students put down exercises that fit under that. So under that, a student puts bench press, he puts shoulder press, he puts dumbbell row, he, just a variation of exercises that would incorporate the upper body. He wouldn't have to put a exact definition of those exercises, but the fact that he's able to make that connection between all of those exercises fitting in a group and fitting under that label demonstrates that student's knowledge of the application of those exercises. And that's really what this hammers home, is the real world application rather than any sort of academic knowing and remembering and recalling a definition for anything, but really just having real world applications through this method. Now, how did I become familiar with this strategy? Obviously, the reading of the text allowed for a better understanding of how to implement it and a better way to reinforce this with students. But really, this method, it just falls all under prior experience with the strategy. Now, what do I mean by that? I really mean anytime you implement a new concept, you're going to be building a connection to the previous concepts you've already established in your life. Now, going back to physical education as a example, let's say I introduce the front squat to my students. Well, if I've already shown them the back squat and I've already shown them how to do a bodyweight squat, then when I introduce the front squat, it's simply a different variation, and that's a connection they can make. They can make that connection. Once they hear front squat, they think squat. They're like, oh, I already know how to do that. Whenever I try to perform a front squat, I'll be proficient at it. As proficient as someone can be when they first pick it up. Now, let's say, for example, they are very new. They have no concept of lifting weights, and I throw the front squat at them. There is no previous connection they can really establish or make with it. So that first bit of learning, that first bit of knowledge that they have to, try and incorporate in their, within themselves, it's going to be more difficult. However, if they have a real world application of this list group label method, they can then incorporate that new concept into a previous bank of knowledge that they already have stored within themselves. And that takes me on into why should you choose this strategy? Well, as I've already mentioned, it helps build connections between words or terms that they've already learned before. They can develop vocabulary without definitions using this method. Like I said, if I perform a front squat to my students and I want them to replicate it, they don't have to give any sort of definition or break down the technique, phase by phase to me to show that they have an understanding of it and its application. The fact that they're able to make those connections to, those previous exercises that they've already done that target the same muscle groups shows that they have that baseline understanding that they need to be able to perform the exercise. Now, why else should you choose this, just in a general sense? Well, it can help to build the meaning of unfamiliar words. Again, using a separate example, let's say we want incline bench press. Well, if I've already shown my students bench press, I've already shown my students push-ups, introducing incline bench press is simply just a different variation of it. And because they're able to establish that group under that label in that list form, they're able to understand what this new exercise may be able to do or what they may need to do to perform this new exercise because they're able to establish that group. And this just puts less pressure when the students are trying to learn new vocabulary because they already have that prior knowledge, because they already have that ability to make those connections to things that they already are confident in, things they already know. They're able to, just breeze through any learning of new vocabulary. Now, moving on into how you could integrate this strategy. Well, it can be used when introducing new vocabulary terms. Let's say I'm at the middle of a semester in a strength and conditioning class and I want to throw 10 new exercises at my students. throwing those new exercises at my students after they already have a baseline knowledge of, lifting, just reinforcing within the students that, hey, these are just variations of things you already know. By giving them that by giving them that as a preface, they're going into it under the presupposition that they're going to have to put these new terms in groups. They're going to have to label these new terms, within those groups, and they're just going to have a much easier time integrating this new data within the bank of knowledge they already have. Now, it can also be used to refresh students on past terms. Because they have to use those past terms within their groups, they're still reevaluating the knowledge they have already learned by constantly adding those past terms into the groups that they're having to think of on the spot. Now, going further, we can see that it also allows for a link between unfamiliar and familiar exercises, or just vocabulary terms in general, to be established. They can make a link between an exercise they've never done before and one they have done before, simply by using this method of grouping those two exercises together under a specific label. Just by grouping it together, they're essentially allowing for that data to be more easily incorporated into their knowledge set as they move through the curriculum. Now, how does this benefit students? And trying not to repeat myself too much, it can really help the students to group together exercises by muscle group. And that's just one way you could do it. You could group it by whether it's a dynamic, isometric, eccentric exercise. You could group it with different labels. It doesn't just have to be upper body lifts, muscle groups, that sort of thing. You can do this with any sort of label. And it's as long as the students are able to make those connections, they can learn the definitions of the labels a lot easier. They can learn the new exercises a lot easier. And they can really start to hammer home those old exercises and the applications of all three at the same time. Now, going on into, again, same thing, unfamiliar exercises can be linked to a similar familiar exercise. This just allows for easier incorporation of new data to be better understood by the students. So how can you assess this? Well, you could do a formal pre and post test on the newly integrated terms. Let's say at the beginning of a 9-week period in my strength and conditioning class, I want to throw, again, 10 new exercises at the students. But before I do that, I simply put that 10 exercises on a list along with other exercises they've already been familiar with, they've already been taught, shown how to do, they understand what areas it targets. I can give them that, and they can then try and figure out where they may go. Like, let's say I give them front squats in term, they can say, okay, this front squat sounds like a back squat. It might also target the legs. So as a pre-test, they can kind of be prepared for what they may encounter during that next 9 weeks. However, let's say we go on to the post-test. Well, those 10 new exercises they would have done for the next 9 weeks. And then I go back and I say, okay, here's the same test as the pre-test. Take it over again. Let's see if you made those connections to the groups now after you've been exposed to them. Now, beyond a formal test, you can also have a more informal questioning of the students on their knowledge of the terms. Let's say, for example, they are in the weight room and you performing a back squat. Well, you can go up to students and critique their form, but also ask, where do you feel the back squat? Like, what muscle group? Ask them to point specifically to what muscles they feel they're working when they perform the exercise. And that right there, just that simple questioning, is building that bank of knowledge of, really they have to think about, okay, yeah, I'm doing it. I feel where the muscle's working, but where do I feel it? And doing that across multiple exercises, they're able to understand like, hey, the back squat targets my quadriceps, but so does the front squat. And that connection can be made to where they can then go on, and further use that knowledge to their own benefit. So basically, the list group label method is just a really easy and simple method to implement in your classroom as far as introducing new vocabulary, new terms that the students can then, put together with previous knowledge that they've already been exposed to. And it just helps for a much more smooth transition into learning new terms. And I hope this explanation has helped out in some way of any sort of future teachers out there. Hope this might have helped you out a bit, and I'll see you next time.